The blizzard on Kepler-7 had killed 7 colonists that week. Sergeant Marcus Vane knew the names of all 7. He could recite them in order of death, in order of age, in order of how much they had screamed when the cold took them. He could recite them forward and backward and in his sleep, which was precisely where they visited him every single night, standing in a circle around his cot in the barracks, their faces blue and their lips cracked and their eyes open in that terrible, knowing way that dead people looked at you when they wanted you to understand something important about the nature of dying. Corporal Jenna Hess had been first, 23 years old. She had wandered out of the hydroponics bay to check the external water intake valves because the automated system had flagged a pressure drop, and she had not worn her full cold weather gear because the walkway between the bay and the intake station was enclosed and heated, and she had made that walk 200 times before without incident. But the heating element in the walkway had failed, and the emergency seals had frozen shut, and by the time anyone realized she had not returned, she had been lying in a collapsed section of the corridor for 47 minutes. They found her curled in a ball against the wall, her fingers wrapped around a broken heating patch, her mouth open in a silent scream that the cold had frozen into her throat like a sculpture of agony. The medics said she had been conscious for most of it. They said her core temperature had dropped so slowly that her brain had remained aware, had registered every degree of heat leaving her body, had catalogued every sensation of her cells crystallizing one by one until the final shudder that was not quite a shudder but more of a settling, like snow coming to rest on a branch that could no longer hold it. Marcus had been the one to carry her body back to the morgue. She had weighed almost nothing. That was what he could not forget, not the blue face, not the frozen scream, not the way her fingers had snapped off at the joints when they tried to uncurl them from the heating patch, but the weight. She had weighed almost nothing, as if dying on Kepler-7 meant giving up not just your warmth but your substance, your mass, your claim on the physical universe itself. He had carried her like a collection of empty clothes, and the feeling of that, the terrible, impossible lightness of a person who had been alive and was now only a shape, had lodged itself somewhere inside his ribcage like a splinter of ice that would not melt. After Jenna Hess had come Tomas Ruiz, age 51, the colony's structural engineer, who had gone out to inspect a stress fracture in the northern habitat wall and had simply not come back. They found him the next morning, 100 meters from the habitat entrance, face down in a snowdrift with his flashlight still on and its beam pointing at nothing. His thermal suit had malfunctioned, a manufacturing defect in the seam seal, a gap no wider than a human hair that had allowed the planet's murderous cold to seep in like water through a crack in a dam. The cold did not rush. It did not surge. It entered with the patience of something that knew it had all the time in the world, and by the time Ruiz had felt the first whisper of wrongness against his lower back, the cold had already claimed enough of him that running was no longer an option. They found frost patterns on his skin that the forensic tech said were consistent with him trying to crawl. He had made it 17 meters. 17 meters. Marcus had measured it himself, packing it out in the snow while the recovery team bagged what remained of Tomas Ruiz, and he had thought about those 17 meters and what they must have cost. Every centimeter a negotiation between the body's desperate need to survive and the cold's absolute indifference to that need. 17 meters of a 51-year-old man dragging himself through snow that was trying to kill him, his fingers clawing at ice that would not yield, his lungs pulling in air that was not air at all but a substance so cold it burned, his eyes fixed on the lights of the habitat that must have seemed like the lights of heaven itself, close enough to see, too far to reach. The other 5 had died in variations of the same story. Equipment failure, human error, the planet's cold finding whatever gap existed between preparation and reality and slipping through it with the precision of a surgeon and the cruelty of something that had never known mercy and never would. Kepler-7 was not malicious, that was the worst part. Malice implied intent, implied a mind that could potentially be reasoned with or resisted or hated. Kepler-7 did not hate humanity. Kepler-7 did not care about humanity. Kepler-7 was simply cold. Cold in a way that made the concept of cold on Earth seem like a pleasant memory, cold in a way that redefined what the word meant, cold as a fundamental property of existence rather than a weather condition. The average surface temperature was negative 112 degrees Celsius. The nighttime temperature dropped to negative 160. The coldest temperature ever recorded on Earth had been negative 89.2 in Antarctica, and the scientists on Kepler-7 had laughed when they learned that, a bitter, hollow laugh that tasted like iron and regret, because negative 89 was a summer afternoon on this world. It was practically tropical. Marcus Vane had stopped counting the reasons humanity should have never settled this frozen rock. But the reasons kept coming, piling up like snow against the habitat walls, and the snow never stopped. Now on the 8th day of the week, if weeks could be said to exist on a planet with a rotational period of 31 standard hours, Marcus was leading a recovery patrol through waist-deep snow because the colony's primary communications array had gone down in the last storm, and Command wanted it restored before the next storm hit, which the meteorologists estimated would be in approximately 4 hours. 4 hours to trek 2 kilometers through a frozen hellscape, climb a glacier wall, and repair equipment that had been designed by engineers who had never set foot on a planet colder than a meat locker. 4 hours with a 6-person team, 3 of whom were fresh arrivals from the last supply transport, and had not yet learned the particular way Kepler-7 tried to kill you, the way it waited until you were just comfortable enough to lower your guard, and then introduce some new horror you had not prepared for because you had not known it existed. "This is bullshit," said Private Chen from the rear of the formation. He was 20 years old, born on a station in Earth orbit, and had never experienced natural weather before Kepler-7. Marcus had watched him step off the transport shuttle 3 days ago and seen the expression on his face when the cold hit him for the first time, not just the temperature but the weight of it, the way it pressed against you like a physical force, the way it seemed to have opinions about your presence and none of them were favorable. Chen had looked like a man who had just been told that God was real and he hated you specifically. "Watch your spacing," Marcus said without turning around. "When you bunch up, you create thermal shadows. The cold finds gaps in formation the way water finds cracks in a hull." "How do you know that?" "Because 7 people are dead." Silence from the rear. Marcus did not enjoy using the dead that way, turning them into lessons, into cautionary tales, into ammunition for discipline. But he had learned in his 22 years of military service that guilt was a luxury and survival was a responsibility. And if the memory of Jenna Hess frozen in a corridor kept Private Chen alive through the next 4 hours, then her death had purchased something of value, which was more than most deaths could claim. The patrol moved forward in a staggered column, each person maintaining 3 meters of distance from the next, headlamps cutting pale cones through the white chaos of the storm. The snow on Kepler-7 was not like Earth snow. It was finer, almost powdery, and it had a faint bluish tint that came from trace minerals in the atmosphere, crystallized deposits of some compound that the geologists had identified but could not agree on a name for. It looked beautiful in photographs. In photographs, the blue snow stretching to the horizon under a sky full of stars that burned brighter than any stars visible from Earth gave the impression of serenity, of peace, of a world untouched by the mess and noise of civilization. In person, it was a lie. The blue snow got into everything. It worked its way through seals and zippers and joints. It accumulated on equipment and formed ice crystals that were nearly impossible to remove. It reflected light in strange ways that made depth perception unreliable and had caused 3 separate falls in Marcus's team alone during this patrol. It was beautiful and it was treacherous, and Marcus had come to understand that this was true of most things on Kepler-7. The planet did not need to be ugly to be deadly. It could afford to be gorgeous. It had that kind of confidence. They were 40 minutes into the trek when the glacier came into view. It rose from the snowfield like a wall of frozen history, a sheer face of compressed ice that stretched upward for approximately 90 meters and extended laterally for as far as the eye could see in both directions. The geological surveys indicated that the glacier was part of a much larger ice formation that extended several kilometers below the surface, a remnant of some ancient climatic event that had locked an ocean's worth of water into a single massive structure. The ice was layered, bands of white and blue and clear, each layer representing thousands of years of accumulation, each layer containing microscopic bubbles of atmosphere from epochs so distant that the planet itself had been a different world when they were sealed away. Scientists at the colony had drilled core samples from the glacier and had found air pockets containing traces of organic compounds that suggested Kepler-7 had once been warmer, not Earth-warm, but warm enough for liquid water, warm enough for something to have lived in it, warm enough that the planet's current state was not its natural condition, but its punishment for some catastrophe that had occurred deep in the geological past. Marcus did not care about any of that. He cared about the communications array, which was mounted on a platform halfway up the glacier face, accessible by a maintenance ladder that had been installed during the colony's initial construction and had not been properly maintained since, because maintenance budgets on frontier colonies were always the first thing to be cut and the last thing to be restored. He cared about getting his team up the ladder, fixing the array, and getting back to the habitat before the next storm hit, because the next storm was predicted to be significantly worse than the current one, and significantly worse on Kepler-7 meant storms that could strip the paint off a shuttle and freeze a human solid in under 4 minutes. Diaz take point on the ladder, Chen you're behind him, Okada you and Vasquez secure the base, Park you're with me on the platform. The team moved into position with the mechanical efficiency of trained soldiers, and Marcus watched them go with the particular anxiety of a man responsible for other people's lives in an environment that treated human life as an inconvenience. He had been doing this for long enough that the anxiety had become a constant companion, A low hum in the back of his skull that never fully quieted, not during missions, not during rest, not during the brief and fitful sleep that Kepler-7 allowed him between shifts. He had learned to function with it, the way a person learned to function with a chronic pain, not ignoring it, not overcoming it, simply carrying it alongside everything else, one more weight in a life that had become an exercise in bearing weight. He was the last to climb the ladder. The metal rungs were coated in a thin layer of ice that his gloves could barely grip, and the wind pushed against him with a persistence that felt personal, as if the storm had identified him as the leader and decided that breaking him would be the most efficient way to break the entire team. Each step was a negotiation, grip, pull, brace, step, repeated with the monotonous rhythm of a rosary. Each rung a prayer and each meter a small act of faith that the ladder would hold, and the ice would not claim him the way it had claimed the others. The platform was a 12-meter square of grated metal bolted to the glacier face, surrounded by a waist-high railing that was covered in rime ice and swaying slightly in the wind. The communications array rose from the center of the platform, a cylindrical structure about 4 meters tall, bristling with antennae and sensor housings, its surface frosted over to the point that it looked less like a piece of technology and more like a natural formation, something the glacier had grown rather than something humans had built. Diaz was already at the array's maintenance panel, his fingers working the controls with the quick precision of a man who had done this before. "Power relays fried," he said over the team channel. "Solar collectors iced over and the backup battery drained sometime in the last storm. I can reroute through the secondary power system, but it's going to take about 20 minutes. 20 minutes, Marcus repeated. The meteorological data scrolled across his visor display, storm front approaching, estimated arrival 3 hours and 12 minutes, wind speeds increasing to 120 kilometers per hour with gusts up to 180. They had time, not much, but time. 20 minutes, Diaz confirmed. Maybe 25 if the cold keeps messing with the panel controls. Make it 20. Marcus turned to survey the glacier face while Diaz worked. From this height, approximately 45 meters above the snowfield, the view was simultaneously spectacular and terrifying. The frozen plains stretched outward in every direction, a white void broken only by the faint outline of the habitat complex 3 kilometers to the south. A cluster of prefabricated modules that looked from here like toys, scattered on a table, insignificant and fragile against the immensity of the world that surrounded them. Above, the sky was clear between the clouds, a black so deep it seemed to have texture, scattered with stars that burned with a ferocity that Earth's atmosphere had always softened and hidden. On Kepler-7, there was no atmosphere to speak of, at least not in the way humans understood atmosphere. The air was thin, barely above the threshold of survivability without rebreather assistance, and it did not scatter light the way Earth's thick blanket of nitrogen and oxygen did. Stars on Kepler-7 did not twinkle. They glared. They stared down at the frozen world with an intensity that felt like judgment. Marcus had grown up on Earth, in a coastal town in what had once been called Portugal before the planetary reorganization of 2187. He remembered the sky of his childhood, blue during the day, velvet black at night, soft and forgiving, and full of the gentle light of a sun that cared about the things it illuminated. The sky on Kepler-7 did not care. Nothing here cared. That was the fundamental lesson this planet taught, the lesson that killed people who refused to learn it. The universe did not care about you, and the sooner you accepted that, the sooner you could start making decisions based on reality instead of hope. He had accepted it, he thought, mostly. Except at night when the dead visited him and he heard Jenna Hess's voice in his head asking why he had not checked the walkway heating elements himself, why he had not insisted on full cold weather protocols for every single movement outside the primary habitat, why he had allowed comfort to override caution. He had no answers for her. He had only the memory of her weight in his arms, or rather, the absence of it, the terrible lightness of a body that had given up everything to the cold. "Sir," Park's voice cut through the spiral of memory. She was standing at the railing on the north side of the platform, her headlamp pointed down at the glacier face. "You need to see this." Marcus crossed to her position and followed her gaze downward. At first, he saw nothing, the same blue-white ice, the same layered bands of frozen time, the same indifferent surface that the glacier had presented to the sky for millennia. Then his eyes adjusted and he saw what Park had seen. There was a crack in the glacier. Not a surface fracture, those were everywhere, a natural consequence of the ice expanding and contracting with temperature fluctuations, but something deeper. A gap in the ice that extended inward at an angle, disappearing into the blue-black depths of the glacier with a darkness that the headlamp could not penetrate. The edges of the crack were smooth, almost polished, as if something had melted its way through rather than broken through, and there was a faint glow visible in the depths. Not the reflected light of their headlamps, but something else, something intrinsic, a dim blue luminescence that pulsed with a rhythm that was too slow and too regular to be natural. Ice Fisher, Chen said, coming to stand beside them. His voice was carefully casual, the way people sounded when they were trying not to sound afraid. Probably just some kind of mineral deposit. The geology brief mentioned luminescent compounds in the deeper ice layers. The geology brief also said the dragons were extinct, Park said quietly. Marcus felt something move in his chest, not quite fear, not quite curiosity, but something in the space between, an awareness that tugged at the edges of his attention like a thread caught on a nail. The dragons of Kepler-7 were the colony's most famous scientific footnote. The terraforming survey team had discovered fossilized remains during the initial orbital scans, bones embedded deep in the ice, preserved with a perfection that bordered on the miraculous. The largest specimens had measured over 40 meters in length, with wingspans estimated at 60 meters or more. The skeletal structure was unlike anything in Earth's biological record, a hexaptal base plan with 2 additional limb pairs modified into wings and a secondary set of forelimbs that appeared to have served some unknown purpose. The skulls were enormous, dominated by eye sockets that suggested vision far more sophisticated than human sight, and the teeth, where they had been preserved, were not bone but crystalline structures of a composition that no laboratory had been able to fully analyze. The fossils had been dated to approximately 12,000 years before present, placing them in the same era as the atmospheric shift that had turned Kepler-7 from a marginally habitable world into a frozen wasteland. The prevailing theory was that the dragons had been adapted to the planet's warmer period and had been rendered extinct by the sudden onset of deep freeze conditions. It was a neat theory. It was a sensible theory. It was a theory that allowed humans to feel safe, because extinct things could not hurt you, could not compete with you, could not challenge your assumption that you were the most significant species on any planet you chose to visit. Marcus stared at the blue glow pulsing in the depths of the fissure, and thought that neat theories had a way of being wrong at the worst possible moment. Daya's status on the array. 15 minutes, maybe 18. Keep working, Park Chen, back away from the fissure. Okada Vasquez, I want a thermal scan of the glacier face from your position. Look for any heat signatures, anything above ambient. Report immediately. Copy, Sergeant. Okada's voice came back crisp and professional from the base of the ladder. Marcus stayed at the railing. The blue glow pulsed again, slower this time, or maybe he was imagining the difference, projecting pattern onto randomness because his tired and frightened brain wanted there to be a pattern, wanted the world to make sense even when it refused. The wind pushed against him. The cold pressed in from all sides, finding the gaps in his thermal suit with its usual inexorable patience. The glacier loomed beside him, ancient and enormous and full of secrets that humans had not earned the right to know. That was when he heard the sound. It was small, so small that in any other context on Earth, in a habitat, anywhere that the background noise of existence was louder than a whisper, he would not have heard it at all. But here, on the platform above the snowfield, with the storm momentarily between gusts and the silence of Kepler-7 pressing in like a physical thing, the sound reached him with a clarity that was almost obscene. It was a whimper. Desperate, broken. The sound of something that had been making noise for a long time and was running out of the energy to continue. It was high-pitched, too high for a human, too high for any animal Marcus had ever heard, and it carried a quality that he had never encountered in all his years of service, a quality that bypassed his analytical mind entirely and went straight to something older and deeper, something in the architecture of his nervous system that had been built before language and before reason and before the invention of the concept of safety. It was the sound of a baby. Not a human baby, the frequencies were wrong, the cadence was wrong, everything about it was wrong except the essential thing, the thing that all baby sounds shared regardless of species. The declaration of helplessness, the announcement of need, the raw and unfiltered cry of something that was too young to protect itself and knew it. Marcus's hand moved to his sidearm before he consciously decided to draw it. Old reflex. Unknown threat, reach for the weapon, create distance, assess. 22 years of training speaking through his muscles while his brain caught up. He swept his headlamp across the glacier face, and the beam found the fissure again, and this time he saw movement. Something was coming out. It was small, absurdly, impossibly small, no larger than his boot, and it was crawling. Not walking, not running, but crawling with the clumsy, dragging motion of a creature that did not have full control of its limbs, that was using every ounce of its diminishing strength to move forward because forward was the only direction that mattered. It emerged from the fissure onto the glacier's surface like a dark drop of ink spreading on white paper, and Marcus's headlamp caught it full on, and his mind went blank. It was reptilian, That was the first word his brain supplied, and it was the wrong word but the closest available, the way a person might describe the ocean as wet, technically accurate but catastrophically insufficient. The creature was covered in scales, yes, but the scales were not like any reptile Marcus had ever seen in zoos or documentaries or biology texts. They were deep obsidian in color, so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and running through them in intricate patterns like river deltas seen from orbit were veins of faint blue luminescence. The same blue that glowed in the fissure, the same blue that pulsed in the glacier's depths, but brighter now, more concentrated, pulsing with a rhythm that was unmistakably biological. The scales shifted as the creature moved, overlapping and separating with a fluid precision that suggested engineering rather than evolution. Each scale a component in a system that was designed for something more complex than simple protection. Its body was compact and low-slung, with 4 short limbs that ended in claws too small to be threatening but too sharp to be cute. Behind it, 2 wings dragged in the snow, crumpled, wet, frostbitten, the delicate membrane between the wing bones cracked and oozing something that was not quite blood and not quite ice, but some substance in between that steamed faintly where it contacted the frozen surface. The wings were beautiful in a way that made Marcus's chest ache, because they were clearly meant to be something magnificent, broad and powerful and built for flight in a sky full of stars. And they were destroyed, ruined by cold and exposure, and whatever catastrophe had separated this creature from wherever it was supposed to be. Its head was large relative to its body, dominated by 2 enormous eyes that caught Marcus's headlamp and reflected it back in shades of amber and gold that were so vivid, so saturated, so impossibly alive against the blue-white deadness of the glacier that they looked like small suns burning in the darkness. The eyes were fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step backward, because there was something in that gaze that he recognized and did not want to recognize. Something that he had seen in human eyes, in the eyes of soldiers under fire, in the eyes of patients in trauma wards, in the eyes of the dying and the desperate and the ones who had been abandoned and knew it. It was intelligence, not animal awareness, not instinctive processing, but actual intelligence. The kind that understood its situation, that could assess its options, that had made a calculation and arrived at a conclusion, and was now acting on that conclusion with every remaining scrap of willpower it possessed. The creature had seen Marcus, it had assessed him, and it had decided that he was its best chance. The thought was absurd. Marcus was a soldier on a frozen planet, armed with a standard-issue sidearm and a thermal suit that was losing its battle with the cold, standing on a platform bolted to a glacier that was full of fossils of creatures that could have swallowed him whole. He was not anyone's best chance. He was barely his own best chance. But the creature was crawling toward him anyway, dragging its ruined wings through the snow, leaving a trail of dark fluid and blue luminescence behind it like a comet's tail in miniature. And its eyes never left his face, and its whimper never stopped. And Marcus realized that his hand had moved away from his sidearm and was now hanging at his side open, fingers slightly spread, in a position that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with something much older. It reached the base of the ladder. It looked up, a motion that seemed to cost it enormously, its tiny neck straining, its body trembling with the effort, and it made another sound. Not a whimper this time, something else. Something that resonated in Marcus's chest like a low note struck on an instrument he did not know he possessed. It was not a sound that asked for help. It was a sound that demanded it, not with aggression, but with an authority that transcended aggression, an authority that came from a place so deep in the hierarchy of existence that human concepts of dominance and submission did not apply. Then the creature did something that stopped Marcus's breath entirely. It opened its tiny jaw and it released a breath. Not a sound, a breath. An exhalation of something that was not quite air and not quite vapor, but a substance that existed in the space between states. A mist of crystalline particles that poured from the creature's mouth in a stream so cold it was visible even in the already frigid air. A ribbon of absolute cold that struck the ladder rungs and the ice beneath and the air itself, and transformed everything it touched. The metal of the ladder crystallized, not frosted, not iced, but crystallized, its surface reshaping itself into geometric patterns of impossible precision, hexagonal structures that grew and multiplied and spread like living architecture. The snow around the creature's body rearranged itself into formations that looked like fractals, like snowflakes magnified 1,000 times, like the frozen thoughts of a mind that thought in mathematics instead of words. The air itself seemed to thicken and clarify, the moisture in it condensing into delicate lattices that hung suspended for a moment before settling to the ground like glass feathers. The breath lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then the creature's jaw closed and it swayed and its amber eyes dimmed, and Marcus understood with a certainty that dropped through him like a stone through water that the breath had cost the creature something it could not afford to spend. It was not a weapon. It was not a defense mechanism. It was something the creature had done to be seen, to be noticed, to say I am here and I am real and I am not like anything you have encountered before. And the cost of saying it might be everything it had left. Not fire. The legends from old Earth had always described dragons breathing fire, great gouts of flame that melted armor and incinerated armies. Marcus had grown up with those stories, had read them to his younger sister when she was small and afraid of the dark, had loved the idea of creatures so powerful they could weaponize heat itself. But the legends had gotten it backward. Or maybe they had been right all along. Maybe the dragons of Earth, if they had ever existed, had breathed fire because fire was what their world required. Fire was the element of power on a world that was warm and wet and full of green growing things. But this was Kepler 7. This was a world where cold was the dominant force, where the ice was a mile deep and the sky was black and the stars burned with the cold light of indifference. On this world, power was not measured in heat but in its absence. On this world, a dragon did not breathe fire. It breathed winter. The creature was dying. Marcus could see it now with a clarity that the headlamp made merciless. The way its movements had slowed, the way its limbs trembled not with effort but with the loss of it, the way the blue luminescence beneath its scales was fading from a steady pulse to an irregular flicker, like a light bulb in a failing circuit. Its core temperature, and Marcus had no way to measure this, but he could feel it radiating from the creature like cold from an open freezer, could feel it across the distance between them was dropping. Whatever internal process generated the cold that was this creature's nature, that process was failing, running out of fuel, shutting down, and without it the creature was as vulnerable to Kepler 7 cold as any human. More vulnerable, perhaps, because a human could be warmed with blankets and heaters and the chemical heat packs in their survival gear. But what did you do for a creature that was cold by nature, that breathed cold, that was made of cold? How did you save something that was dying of the very thing it was made of? Marcus did not know. He did not have time to know. He had spent 22 years in the military, and if those years had taught him anything, it was this. There were moments when thinking was the wrong response. Moments when the gap between perception and action had to be zero, when the body had to move before the mind could catch up and introduce doubt and caution, and all the other civilized refinements that got people killed in situations where only speed mattered. Those moments were rare. Marcus had experienced perhaps a dozen of them in his entire career. He recognized this as one. He climbed down the ladders. Sergeant Diaz's voice crackled in his ear. What are you doing? The arrays almost. Maintain position, Marcus said. His hands moved on the rungs with a speed and sureness that surprised him, as if his body had already made the decision and was simply executing it while his brain watched in bemused admiration. All units maintain position. I'm going to the base of the glacier. Sir, that's outside the mission parameters. I'm aware. He reached the bottom of the ladder and stepped off into the snow. The glacier face loomed above him, blue and white and ancient, and at its base the creature was still crawling toward him. It had covered perhaps 5 meters since emerging from the fissure, and those 5 meters had cost it so much that it was now moving in a halting, stuttering pattern a few centimeters forward. A pause, a tremor through its entire body, a few more centimeters. The trail it left behind was darker now, the fluid from its wings more pronounced, and the blue luminescence beneath its scales had dimmed to a faint glow that was visible only when the light hit it at the right angle. It was 5 meters away, then 3, then 2. Marcus knelt. The snow was cold against his knees, even through the thermal suit, and the wind pushed against his back with the persistence of something that wanted him to stand up and retreat to the platform and the mission and the safety of procedure. Every instinct from 2 decades of military service was telling him to step back. Unknown species, unpredictable biology, potentially dangerous. The creature had just demonstrated the ability to alter matter at a molecular level with its breath. And it was a baby that could do that. What would an adult be capable of? What would a healthy one be capable of? What would happen if the parent of this creature appeared, drawn by the baby's distress call or its fading luminescence or some other signal that Marcus's human senses could not detect? He did not care. He did not care because the creature's eyes were locked on his face, and what he saw in them was not threat or aggression or the alien incomprehension that the xenobiology textbooks always warned about. What he saw was recognition. The creature looked at him the way a drowning person looks at a hand extended over the water, with an understanding that the hand might not be strong enough, that the grip might fail, that the rescue might not work, but with a willingness to try anyway because the alternative was drowning, and drowning was not acceptable. The creature reached his boot. It paused there, its tiny body pressed against the insulated fabric, its claws curling weakly into the snow. It opened its jaw again, but this time no breath came, only a small, broken sound, more vibration than voice, that Marcus felt in his bones rather than heard with his ears. It was the sound of something that had been calling for help for a very long time and was running out of calls. Marcus reached down. His hands were gloved, standard-issue thermal gloves with conductive fingertips for equipment interface, and he could feel the cold radiating from the creature even through the insulation. It was a different kind of cold than Kepler-7 ambient temperature. It was focused, intentional, alive, a cold that had direction and purpose, that was not simply the absence of heat but the presence of something else, something that occupied the same conceptual space as cold but was fundamentally other. His gloves were designed to protect against temperatures down to negative 150 degrees Celsius, and the cold from the creature was making them sting. He cupped his hands around the creature's body and lifted it. It weighed almost nothing. The thought hit him like a physical blow, the same thought he had had when carrying Jenna Hess, the same terrible recognition of weightlessness, of a being that was giving up its substance to the cold. But where Jenna's weightlessness had been the absence of life, this creature's weightlessness was something different. It was the lightness of something small and young and not yet fully formed, the lightness of potential rather than loss, the lightness of a thing that had not yet had the chance to become heavy with the accumulated mass of existence. It was lighter than he expected, maybe 2 kilograms, and it fit in his hands with a completeness that was startling. As if his palms had been designed for this, as if some ancient engineer had sized human hands to the specifications of dragon hatchlings, and then forgotten to include that information in the species documentation. Its body was slick with ice, not the external ice of the environment but ice that grew from within, crystalline structures emerging from its scales like sweat made of frozen light. The blue luminescence was so faint now that it was barely visible, a ghost of light beneath the obsidian scales, and the creature's heartbeat, he could feel it through his gloves, a rapid flutter like a bird's heart, too fast, irregular, skipping beats and then racing to catch up, was the only evidence that it was still alive. It was so cold. The cold sank through his gloves and into his hands and from his hands into his wrists and from his wrists up his forearms, and it did not feel like the cold of Kepler-7. Kepler-7 cold was an assault, it pushed and shoved and demanded entry. This cold was a presence. It settled into his tissues with the gentleness of something that belonged there, as if his body was a house and the cold was a resident returning home after a long absence. It was not painful exactly. It was more like an ache that had depth to it, an ache that went all the way down to the marrow of his bones, and whispered to something in that marrow that had been sleeping for his entire life. His thermal regulator screamed at him. Core temperature dropping, hypothermia risk, seek shelter immediately, warning tissue damage imminent, warning neural function compromised. The warnings cascaded across his visor display in red text that pulsed with the same urgency as the creature's fatting heartbeat, and Marcus looked at the red text and looked at the blue glow dying in his hands and made a choice that was not really a choice at all. He unzipped his thermal jacket. The cold hit his chest like a fist, the real cold, Kepler-7 cold, the cold that had killed 7 people and would kill more if given the chance. It rushed into the gap in his jacket with an eagerness that was almost hungry, and for a moment the two colds competed, the planet's brutal, indiscriminate cold and the creature's focused, living cold, and Marcus was the battlefield between them, his body the territory they fought over. He tucked the hatchling against his chest, against his bare skin, and the two colds merged into something that was neither. The creature's body pressed against his sternum, and the cold from it spread across his skin in a pattern that was not random. It followed the lines of his ribs, traced the branches of his blood vessels, mapped the architecture of his body with a precision that was too deliberate to be accidental. The blue luminescence flickered once, twice, and then steadied, not brightening, not recovering but stabilizing, holding on, as if the contact with his body heat had given it just enough to keep going. The creature's heartbeat slowed, not stopping, slowing, finding a rhythm that matched his. The flutter became a pulse, the pulse became a beat, and the beat settled into a cadence that Marcus felt in his own chest, as if his heart had grown a second chamber that was not his but was beating in time with him anyway. "Yeah," he muttered through chattering teeth. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles in his neck were cramping. The cold from the creature against his skin was beyond anything he had ever experienced, colder than the time he had fallen into an ice shelf during training on Mars, colder than the cryogenic pods on the transport to Kepler-7, colder than anything his frame of reference had a category for. And yet he did not pull the creature away. Noted. He stood up with the dragon pressed against him. His legs were shaking. His vision was narrowing at the edges, the first sign of hypothermia-induced cognitive impairment. His hands, holding the creature in place, had gone from stinging to numb to something beyond numb, a state of sensation that his nervous system had no name for, as if the signals from his fingers had been translated into a language his brain could not read. He started walking back toward the outpost. Not the platform, the outpost, the habitat, the cluster of modules 3 kilometers south that represented the only warmth on this entire godforsaken world. The communications array could wait. Command could wait. The mission could wait. The creature's heartbeat against his chest was slowing. Its luminescence was fading. Its body was growing colder even against his skin. And he had perhaps 30 minutes before it died in his hands, and 30 minutes was not enough to reach the habitat on foot, but it was enough to try, and trying was the only thing he had left. Sergeant Diaz's voice in his ear strained. "Sir, what is your status? We're seeing a significant thermal anomaly from your position." "I'm coming back to the habitats." "What about the arrays?" "Leave it or fix it, I don't care, I'm coming back." A pause, then Okada's voice, calm and steady in the way that only people who were very frightened could be calm and steady. "Sergeant, the thermal scan of the glacier is showing changes. The fissure is expanding. There are heat signatures, no, not heat, cold signatures moving beneath the surface. Multiple contacts. They're deep, but they're moving and they're converging on your position." Marcus did not slow down. He held the creature tighter against his chest, and it made a small sound that might have been pain or might have been gratitude or might have been something for which no human word existed. And he walked through the waist-deep snow with the cold eating him alive and the thing that was not fire but winter pressed against his heart. And for the first time in weeks, for the first time since Jenna Hess had stopped screaming and started settling, Marcus Vane walked like a man who had something worth surviving for. The snow swirled around him. The wind pushed at his back, then shifted and pushed at his front, then shifted again and seemed to push from all directions at once, as if it could not decide whether to help him or kill him and had settled for doing both simultaneously. The habitat lights were visible in the distance, 3 kilometers, 2.5, 2, and with each step the creature's heartbeat grew a little fainter and a little slower. And the blue glow beneath its scales dimmed a little more, and Marcus walked faster, his boots breaking through the crust of the snow and sinking into the powder beneath, his breath freezing in front of his face in clouds that the wind tore apart like shredded paper. 1.5 kilometers. The cold from the creature had spread across his entire torso now. He could feel it in his lungs, each breath drawing in air that was cold and then drawing in cold that was not air at all, a second cold layered on top of the first, a cold that lived in the creature's body and was leaking into his. His core temperature was in freefall. The thermal regulator had stopped warning him and had moved to pleading, the text on his visor shifting from red to a deeper red that he had never seen before, a color that the display was not designed to produce, but was manufacturing out of desperation. 1 kilometer, the creature stirred. Its tiny claws curled against his skin, not gripping, not holding, just touching as if it wanted him to know it was still there, still alive, still fighting. The blue luminescence pulsed once weakly, and Marcus felt the pulse in his own chest, felt it synchronize with his heartbeat for a single perfect moment before drifting out of phase again. 500 meters. He could see individual lights in the habitat now, the main bay doors, the observation ports, the emergency beacons on the roof that burned red against the black sky. His legs were numb, his arms were numb. Everything below his neck was a landscape of diminishing sensation that his brain was quietly disconnecting from, like a captain sealing off flooded compartments to keep the ship afloat. The only thing he could feel clearly was the creature against his chest. Its weight, its cold, its heartbeat, the faint electric tingle of its luminescence against his skin like a battery slowly draining. 200 meters. The habitat's external sensors detected him and the bay doors began their grindingly slow opening cycle. Warmth leaked from the gap, actual warmth, generated warmth, the warmth of heaters and human bodies and machines that burned fuel to push back the cold. It hit him like a wall of heat that was probably only 15 degrees above freezing, but felt like a tropical ocean after what he had just walked through. 100 meters, the creature's heartbeat skipped, then skipped again. Then resumed, irregular and weak, a drum being played by hands that were too tired to lift themselves. 50 meters, the bay doors were open wide enough for a person to enter. Marcus could see faces inside Diaz, who must have descended from the platform and run back ahead of him, and Okada and others, colonists and personnel who had been drawn by the sensor alerts, and the sight of a figure walking alone through a blizzard with something glowing faintly against his chest. 20 meters, 10-5. Marcus Vane walked through the bay doors of the Kepler-7 colony habitat with a freezing dragon baby pressed against his bare skin, and the doors closed behind him, and the warmth of human civilization wrapped around them both like a blanket. And the creature's heartbeat, still faint, still fragile, still fighting, continued to beat against his chest in a rhythm that was not quite his and not quite its own but was somehow theirs.
The bay doors sealed shut with a sound like a coffin closing, and the silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear the blood moving through his own ears. It was the silence of manufactured warmth, a particular quality of quiet that existed only inside sealed environments where the atmosphere was controlled and filtered and scrubbed of everything wild and natural and dangerous. It was the silence of human civilization pressing its palms against the void and whispering, "Not yet, not today, we are still here." Marcus had spent most of his adult life inside environments like this one, the pressurized cabins of military transports, the hermetically sealed barracks of frontier outposts, the the sterile corridors of stations where the air tasted like recycled plastic and filtered despair, and he had learned to recognize the silence for what it was, not peace but a negotiated truce with a universe that wanted you dead. The silence was temporary. The silence was always temporary. But for now, in this moment, with the bay doors closed and the heaters running and the creature's heartbeat still tapping against his sternum like a Morse code message from a country that did not appear on any map, the silence was enough. Corporal Diaz was the first to reach him. He came running across the bay floor in that particular gait that soldiers developed, a half-jog, half-lunge that prioritized speed over dignity and looked vaguely ridiculous in any context other than genuine emergency. His face was a study in the conflict between training and bewilderment, his mouth open as if it had formed a question that his brain had then vetoed before it could be spoken. He stopped 2 meters from Marcus, his eyes tracking from Marcus's face to the open front of his thermal jacket to the thing pressed against his chest, and his mouth opened again, and this time the question escaped. "What the hell is that?" "Dragon," Marcus said. The word hung in the heated air of the bay like a coin flipped into still water. It descended slowly, rippling outward through the small cluster of people who had gathered. Okada, who had come in from the exterior with the calm efficiency of someone who had already processed the impossibility and filed it under things to deal with later. And Park, who stood near the doorway with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral in the way that meant she was anything but neutral. And 3 colonists Marcus did not recognize by name, a man and 2 women, who had the wide-eyed look of people who had wandered into the bay looking for a spare power cell and had instead found a man holding a creature that belonged in a museum or a nightmare or both. "That's not," Diaz started and then stopped because the creature in Marcus's arms shifted and the blue luminescence beneath its scales pulsed once, and the light reflected off the metal walls of the bay in a way that made the shadows move incorrectly, as if the geometry of the room had briefly become suggestions rather than rules. "Sir, those are extinct," the surveys said. The surveys were wrong. Marcus said it simply, without emphasis, without drama, with the flat finality of a man reporting a malfunctioning equipment part rather than a paradigm-shattering biological discovery. He did not have the energy for drama. He did not have the energy for much of anything. His legs were trembling, not from the cold anymore because the bay's heating system was doing its aggressive best to replace the heat he had lost, but from the aftermath of the cold, the way a building trembles after an earthquake has stopped, the structure still intact but every joint and bolt and weld vibrating with the memory of the forces that had tried to pull it apart. His core temperature was reading -2.1 degrees Celsius on his visor display, which was a number that should not have been compatible with consciousness. And yet here he was, conscious, standing, holding a dragon hatchling against his chest while his body slowly remembered what warmth felt like and reached for it with the desperate clumsiness of a drowning man reaching for a rope. He started walking toward the medical bay. Not because he had decided to walk toward the medical bay. His legs simply started moving, carrying him in the direction of the only place in the habitat that might have the equipment and the expertise to deal with whatever was happening inside his jacket. His body had taken over the decision-making process from his brain, and his brain, which had been running on adrenaline and stubbornness for the past 3 kilometers, was perfectly content to let it. "I need Dr. Okonkwo," he said over his shoulder, "now." Diaz fell into step beside him, still staring at the creature. "Sergeant, I need to report this. Command is going to." "Command can wait." "Sir, we have an unidentified biological specimen of unknown threat level inside a primary habitat module. Protocol requires immediate notification of." "Corporal," Marcus stopped walking. He turned to face Diaz and Diaz flinched, because there was something in Marcus's eyes that he had never seen before, not anger, not exhaustion, not the cold professional distance that Marcus wore like armor on most days, but something rawer, something that had been dug up from a place so deep inside him that Diaz was not sure Marcus had known it existed. "This creature is dying. It has been dying since I found it. It is approximately 2 kilograms of living tissue that is currently colder than the outside of this habitat, and its heartbeat is slowing, and I can feel it getting lighter in my hands, and if I stop walking and start filing reports, it will die before the report is finished. Do you understand?" Diaz understood. He understood not because of the words, but because of the way Marcus said them, the way a man speaks when he has carried something precious through a storm and will not set it down until he is certain it will not break. Diaz had seen that look once before, in a refugee camp on Europa, on the face of a woman who had walked 11 kilometers across the ice sheet with her infant child wrapped in a heating blanket that had died 6 kilometers into the journey, and who had kept walking anyway, and whose child had survived because the woman's body heat had been enough, barely enough, just enough. The thinnest possible margin between life and death held open by nothing but the refusal to let it close. "Go get Dr. Okonkwo," Diaz said quietly. "I'll handle the rest." Marcus nodded once and started walking again. The corridor between the vehicle bay and the medical bay was 140 meters long, a straight passage of prefabricated walls and recessed lighting and floor panels that had been worn smooth by the passage of boots over the 18 months since the colony had been established. Marcus had walked this corridor hundreds of times, for equipment inspections, for briefings, for the mandatory medical evaluations that command required every 30 days, and that Marcus had learned to approach with the same grim resignation that a man brings to a necessary but unpleasant medical procedure, which was appropriate because that was precisely what they were. He knew every panel seam, every light fixture, every junction box. He could have walked it blindfolded, and on several occasions during power failures he had. But he had never walked it with a dragon. The creature stirred against his chest as he moved, and he felt its tiny body shift, its claws adjusting their grip on his skin, not digging in, not breaking the surface, just resting there with a pressure that was almost gentle, almost tentative, as if the creature was afraid of hurting him. The absurdity of that thought nearly made Marcus laugh out loud. This creature, this impossible, ancient, biologically revolutionary creature, was worried about hurting him. Him, a human, a soldier, a member of a species that had arrived on this planet 18 months ago, and had immediately begun drilling into its ice and strip mining its resources and poisoning its thin atmosphere with the effluent of their generators and their machinery and their relentless, roaring need to turn every wild thing into a useful thing. If any entity in this equation had reason to be concerned about being hurt, it was not the human. But the creature's claws were gentle anyway, and Marcus did not laugh. And the corridor stretched on, and the lights hummed overhead, and the creature's heartbeat continued its slow, irregular cadence against his sternum, and something about the combination of these things, the mechanical and the organic, the human-made and the ancient, the warmth of the corridor and the cold of the creature, created a moment of such peculiar intensity that Marcus knew he would remember it for the rest of his life. Would replay it in his mind on quiet nights and in the moments before sleep and in the last seconds before whatever death eventually found him, because this was the kind of moment that a life could be measured by, the kind that gave all the other moments context and meaning. The medical bay doors opened automatically as he approached, sliding apart with the soft hiss of pressurized seals releasing, and the sterile white light of the bay spilled out into the corridor like a judgment. Dr. Yuna Okonkwo was standing at the main diagnostic terminal when Marcus entered, and she did not look up immediately, because she was in the middle of entering data colony medical records, the endless documentation of minor injuries and psychological evaluations and nutritional assessments that consumed most of her working hours on this frozen world. She was 44 years old, born in Lagos, trained at the Geneva Medical Institute, and she had been the chief medical officer of the Kepler-7 colony for 11 months, which was 4 months longer than the previous CMO had lasted and 2 months longer than the one before that. She had not volunteered for this posting. She had been assigned to it as the result of a disciplinary hearing that she refused to discuss with anyone, and she had accepted the assignment with the quiet, furious dignity of a woman who had been wronged by an institution, but was too professional to let that wrong diminish the quality of her work. She was, by any objective measure, the most competent person on the colony, and Marcus had learned to trust her judgment in medical matters more than he trusted his own. She looked up when the doors opened, and her expression went through a transformation that Marcus would later describe to Diaz as watching a computer crash in real time. First, mild irritation at the interruption. Second, recognition of Marcus, accompanied by a brief cataloging of his visible condition, open jacket, pale skin, trembling, that shifted her expression from irritation to clinical concern. Third, her eyes tracked downward to his chest, to the thing pressed against his skin, and the clinical concern became something else entirely, something that Marcus had never seen on Yuna Okonkwo's face in 11 months of working alongside her. Confusion, pure, unfiltered confusion, the kind that came before fear or wonder or any of the other more dramatic responses, the kind that was simply the brain's refusal to process information that did not fit into any existing category. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. Sergeant Vane, her voice was steady, which was remarkable given what her face was doing. Is that what I think it is? That depends on what you think it is. I think it's a dragon hatchling, but that's impossible because dragons are extinct and I don't believe in impossible things, so I'm going to need you to tell me that it's something else. It's a dragon hatchling. Okonkwo stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then she pointed at the examination table, a waist-high surface of polished metal with integrated scanning equipment and a recessed lighting array that could be configured for various diagnostic procedures, and said, "Put it down." No. No. If I put it down, it dies. Its body temperature is critically low. It's been losing heat since I picked it up, or losing cold, I don't know, I don't understand how this works. But it's stable as long as it's in contact with my skin. When I pulled it away from my chest just now to show you, its heartbeat destabilized. I'm not going to put it down until you can guarantee that whatever you're going to do won't kill it faster than it's already dying. Okonkwo looked at the creature. The creature looked back at her. Its amber eyes were dimmer now. The fierce, burning gold that had stopped Marcus on the glacier had faded to something softer, more muted, like embers being slowly buried in ash. But they were still alive, still aware. Still tracking Okonkwo's face with that unsettling intelligence that made a person feel not observed but read, as if the creature's eyes were not cameras but interpreters, translating the visible surface of a person into something deeper and more true. Okonkwo pulled a portable thermal scanner from the wall mount, a handheld device roughly the size of a brick, with a directional sensor on one end and a small display screen on the other, and aimed it at the creature without getting closer than arm's length. The scanner beeped once, then twice, then emitted a rapid series of beeps that Marcus had never heard it make before, a staccato burst of electronic confusion that sounded almost like alarm. Okonkwo looked at the display. Her face went very still. "Sergeant, I need you to understand that what this scanner is telling me is not physically possible according to any model of biological chemistry that I have ever studied." "Tell me anyway." "Internal body temperature, -47 degrees Celsius." She said the number the way a person says the name of a disease they've just been diagnosed with, carefully, precisely, with the detached specificity of someone trying to keep emotion at bay by focusing on data. "Cellular structure unknown. The scanner can't resolve individual cells. It's reading the tissue as partially crystalline, like a mineral deposit, but with organic molecular signatures overlaid on top. It's as if this creature exists in a state that is simultaneously frozen and alive, as if its biology has found a way to make cold not the enemy of cellular function, but the foundation of it." She moved the scanner slowly along the length of the creature's body, and the beeping continued, each beep corresponding to a new reading that the scanner's programming had not been designed to interpret. Marcus watched her face as she worked, the way her brow furrowed, the way her lips pressed together, the way her eyes narrowed and narrowed again as the data scrolled across the small screen in numbers and symbols that meant nothing to him, but clearly meant a great deal to her. "Metabolic rate is decelerating," she continued, her voice dropping into the rapid, clipped cadence of a doctor delivering a critical report. "Whatever process sustains this creature is shutting down. The crystalline structures in its cells are losing coherence. They're degrading, reverting to standard molecular states, which for this organism appears to be equivalent to organ failure. Estimated time to death based on current rate of degradation." She paused, swallowed. 11 minutes. 11 minutes? Marcus felt the number land in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. 11 minutes. 11 minutes since Jenna Hess. 11 minutes since Tomas Ruiz. 11 minutes was the length of a coffee break, a shower, a conversation about the weather. 11 minutes was nothing. 11 minutes was the space between one breath and the last breath, and it was all the time this creature had left, and Marcus had carried it 3 kilometers through a blizzard to get here, and the universe was going to take it anyway, because the universe did not care about effort or intention or the desperate, aching need for something to matter. He looked down at the creature. Its eyes were still open, still amber, still looking at him, and in that gaze Marcus saw something that shattered the stone in his chest and scattered it into fragments that the warmth of the medical bay could not melt. Trust. The creature trusted him, not with the simple, instinctive trust of an animal that did not know any better, but with the deliberate, conscious trust of a being that understood exactly how bad the situation was and had chosen to believe that Marcus could do something about it. It had crawled out of a fissure in a glacier and dragged itself across the ice and breathed its last reserve of cold into the world to make itself visible, and then it had looked at Marcus Vane, a human soldier on a frozen planet, and it had decided that he was the one. Not randomly, not desperately, with intention, with the weight of a decision made by something old enough and wise enough to know what decisions cost. He could not let it down. He could not carry this creature 3 kilometers through a storm and then stand in a warm room and watch it die. He would not. The universe could take many things from Marcus Vane. It had already taken his peace of mind, his sleep, his ability to look at snow without seeing graves, but it could not take this. Not this. Not the one thing he had done in weeks that felt like something other than failure. "Can you save it?" he asked. Okonkwo looked at him, then at the creature, then at her scanner, then at the ceiling as if the ceiling might have an answer that the scanner did not, then back at the creature. "I don't know," she said. "I don't have a protocol for this. I don't have a reference, a precedent, a baseline. This organism's biology shouldn't exist. It generates cold the way our bodies generate heat. It's a living thermodynamic engine operating in reverse. If I try to warm it with standard medical equipment, I might accelerate the degradation by disrupting the thermal equilibrium its cells need to function." If I try to cool it further, I might push it past the point of no return. I don't know what the right temperature is. I don't know what the right anything is. She set the scanner down on the counter with a careful, deliberate motion, as if the act of putting it down was a decision in itself, a small surrender of the comfort of data in favor of something less certain but potentially more useful. But, she said, and the word carried a weight that shifted the air in the room, I have a thermal stabilization unit in the storage cabinet. It's designed for cryogenic tissue preservation. It can maintain a target temperature within 1/10 of a degree for extended periods. If I can determine what temperature this creature needs, I can hold it there while I figure out the rest. What temperature does it need? The temperature it had when you found it, the temperature it evolved for, which, based on the crystallographic signatures I'm seeing in the scan data, would be somewhere in the range of -60 to -80 degrees Celsius. But I can't be sure, and if I'm wrong. If you're wrong, it dies. If you're right, it lives. If you do nothing, it dies in 11 minutes. Those are the options. Okonkwo stared at him. Then she turned and walked to the storage cabinet with the brisk, no-nonsense stride of a woman who had made a decision and was now going to execute it before doubt could catch up. She pulled open the cabinet door, reached inside, and retrieved a unit that looked like a flattened metal coffin with a hinged transparent lid and a control panel on one end. She set it on the examination table, opened the lid, and began configuring the temperature settings with fingers that moved so fast they were almost a blur. -65 degrees, she said. Middle of the range, best guess. If the crystallographic data is right, that should be close enough to stabilize the cellular structures without shocking them. How long to reach target temperature? 90 seconds from activation, but getting the creature into the unit without breaking skin contact, that's the problem. If its heartbeat destabilizes when you separate it from your body, it might not recover in time. Marcus looked at the stabilization unit, then at the creature, then at his own chest, where the hatchling was pressed against him with its tiny claws resting on his skin and its faint blue light pulsing in a rhythm that was growing slower and slower, like a clock winding down. I'll put it in on 3, he said. As soon as the unit reaches temperature, I transfer directly, no pause, no gap, one motion. That's extremely risky. The thermal differential between your body and the unit will be over 90 degrees. When you open your jacket, the sudden temperature change could. Could what? Kill me? I've been walking around with this thing against my skin for 20 minutes and my core temperature is still -2. I think I can survive a quick transfer. Okonkwo did not argue further. She activated the unit, and a low hum filled the medical bay as the cooling system engaged. The transparent lid frosted over almost immediately, ice crystals blooming across its surface like flowers opening in time-lapse, and the temperature readout on the control panel began counting down from +15 toward -65, with the mechanical patience of a machine that did not care what was at stake. 90 seconds. Marcus counted them in his head, the way he had counted the seconds after Jenna Hess stopped breathing, the way he had counted the meters that Tomas Ruiz had crawled, the way he counted everything on Kepler 7 because counting was the only way to impose order on a world that had none. 1, 2, 3. The creature's heartbeat fluttered against his chest. 4, 5, 6. Okonkwo positioned herself at the examination table, her hands gloved in thermal-resistant medical gloves, ready to assist. 7, 8, 9. The frost on the stabilization unit's lid thickened and the temperature readout crossed 0 and kept falling. 10, 11, 12. Somewhere in the habitat, an alarm went off, a distant, muffled sound that might have been a weather alert or a systems malfunction or something else entirely. Something that Marcus filed away in the part of his mind reserved for things that were not immediately killing him. Diaz burst through the medical bay doors at the 45-second mark, his face flushed and his breathing ragged as if he had been running. Sergeant, we've got a situation. The seismic sensors are picking up activity beneath the glacier. Multiple contacts, deep, moving. Okada says they've been accelerating since you brought the hatchling inside and... Not now, corporals. But sir, the scale of these signatures. Not now. Diaz fell silent. He looked at the stabilization unit. He looked at the creature in Marcus's arms. He looked at the frost spreading across the examination table and the walls and the ceiling of the medical bay, because the cold radiating from the creature and now from the unit was so intense that it was overwhelming the bay's climate control system, ice crystals forming on every surface within a 3-meter radius like a frozen halo. He closed his mouth and stood where he was and did not say anything else because he understood, finally, fully, that what was happening in this room was not a military matter and not a scientific matter and not a protocol matter. It was something else. Something for which there was no manual and no procedure and no chain of command. 60 seconds, the temperature readout showed -40. The hum of the stabilization unit had deepened into a resonant vibration that Marcus could feel in his teeth, a frequency so low it was less a sound than a presence, as if the cold itself was speaking in a voice too deep for human ears. 70 seconds, -55. The creature's heartbeat skipped, then skipped again. Marcus felt each skip like a physical blow, like a fist tapping against his sternum from the inside. Tap, tap, pause, an irregular rhythm that was getting more irregular by the second. The pauses lengthening, the taps weakening, the gap between life and death narrowing to a thread so thin it could not be seen, only felt. 80 seconds, -62. 3 degrees from target. The creature's blue luminescence flickered, not the steady pulse of before, but a desperate, stuttering light like a candle in a wind that was getting stronger. Its amber eyes were still open, still fixed on Marcus's face, and in them he saw something that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Not fear, not pain, but patience. The patience of something that had waited 10,000 years beneath the ice and could wait a little longer, that understood time in a way humans did not, that experienced the 85 seconds between the glacier and the stabilization unit not as an eternity but as an instant, a single beat in a rhythm so long and so slow that human lives were just the spaces between the notes. 85 seconds, -64.3. Almost there, Okonkwo said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Her eyes were locked on the temperature readout with an intensity that bordered on prayer. 88 seconds, -64.8. 89 seconds, -65.0, target reached. Now, Marcus said. He opened his jacket. The warm air of the medical bay hit his chest and the creature simultaneously, and the hatchling's heartbeat stuttered, a long, terrible pause that lasted 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, an empty space in the rhythm where life should have been. And then Marcus's hands were moving, lifting the creature from his chest and placing it into the stabilization unit in a single fluid motion that took less than a second but felt like an hour. Because during that second the creature's eyes never left his face, and in that second Marcus understood with a clarity that went beyond, thought that he was not simply moving a small animal from one surface to another. He was handing something over, completing a transfer that had begun on the glacier when the creature had chosen him, and the success or failure of that transfer would be measured not in seconds or degrees, but in something for which there was no unit of measurement. The creature settled into the stabilization unit. The cold inside the unit closed around it like a hand closing around a precious thing, and the hatchling's body, which had been rigid with the effort of staying alive in an environment that was too warm for it, relaxed. Not went limp, not collapsed, but relaxed, the way a person relaxes when they come home after a long journey, the way a held breath releases when the danger has passed. Its muscles softened, its claws retracted. Its wings, those ruined, frost-bitten wings that had dragged through the snow like broken flags, settled against its body in a position that looked less like damage and more like rest. Its heartbeat stabilized. Marcus heard it through the medical bay's monitoring equipment. Okonkwo had connected the stabilization unit to the diagnostic systems the moment the hatchling was inside, and now a rhythmic beep filled the room, steady and slow and strong, each beep a declaration of continued existence that landed in Marcus's chest like a benediction. The blue luminescence beneath the creature's scales steadied as well, its flickering resolving into a calm, even pulse that matched the heartbeat, and the light spread outward through the frost-covered walls of the medical bay in soft waves of blue that made the room look like the interior of an iceberg, or a cathedral, or a dream. Okonkwo exhaled. It was a long, shuddering breath, the kind that a person releases when they have been holding tension in every muscle of their body and have finally, reluctantly, allowed that tension to dissipate. She slumped against the examination table, one hand pressed flat on its surface for support, and stared at the readout scrolling across her diagnostic display with an expression that was equal parts relief and bewilderment. Cellular degradation has stopped, she said. Crystallographic structures are restabilizing. Heart rate is 32 beats per minute, slow but regular. Respiration is minimal, almost undetectable, but present. It's alive, Sergeant. Whatever we just did, it worked. Marcus did not respond. He was looking at the creature through the frosted lid of the stabilization unit, and the creature was looking back at him through the frost, and the blue light pulsed between them like a conversation in a language that did not use words, and Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. Not the cold, which was still there, a faint echo of the creature's touch that lingered on his skin like a bruise that was not quite a bruise, but something else, something warmer. Something that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the particular geometry of connection that forms between two beings who have saved each other, even if only one of them knows it yet. He sat down on the floor beside the examination table. Not because he was tired, although he was bone-deep tired, the kind of tired that sleep could not fix because it was not in the muscles but in the soul, but because his legs had decided independently of his brain that standing was no longer necessary, and his brain, which had used up its last reserve of willpower on the transfer, was in no condition to argue. He sat with his back against the table's metal leg, his knees drawn up, his hands resting on his thighs, and he looked at the dragon hatchling in its frozen cocoon, and the dragon hatchling looked at him, and neither of them looked away. Diaz cleared his throat. "Sergeant, about the seismic readings." "Tell me." Okonkwo looked up from her displays. Park materialized in the doorway, having apparently followed Diaz at some point during the chaos. Even the 3 colonists who had been in the bay earlier had found their way to the medical bay entrance, drawn by the same gravitational pull of the extraordinary that had brought everyone else here. They stood in a loose semicircle around Marcus and the examination table, and the blue light from the creature painted their faces in shades of ice and shadow, and they looked less like a group of people in a medical bay and more like a congregation in a temple, which was a comparison that Marcus would have rejected as absurd if the evidence in front of him had not made absurdity seem like the most reasonable response available. "The seismic sensors started picking up movement approximately 40 minutes ago," Diaz said, reading from his datapad with the careful diction of a man who knows he is delivering information that will not be believed. "Deep subsurface, approximately 2 kilometers below the glacier. Initial signatures were small, consistent with minor ice displacement, the kind of thing we see during normal temperature fluctuations. But about 20 minutes ago, the signatures changed. They became larger, more organized, multiple contacts all moving in the same direction." "Which direction?" "Toward us, toward the habitat." The medical bay went quiet. The hum of the stabilization unit filled the silence, and the blue light pulsed, and somewhere in the walls, the colony's heating system labored against the cold that the creature and its cocoon were radiating into the room. "How large are these contacts?" Okonkwo asked. Diaz hesitated. It was a small hesitation, a half-second pause, a flicker of something in his eyes, but Marcus caught it, because catching small hesitations was part of what made him good at his job. "That's the thing, Doc. The sensors aren't reading them as discrete objects. They're reading them as a single continuous signature, like one thing, one very, very large thing moving through the ice." "How large?" Another hesitation, longer this time. "The glacier is approximately 4 kilometers deep at its thickest point. The signature extends through approximately 60% of that depth." Marcus did the math in his head. 4 kilometers, 60%, 2.4 kilometers. A single object, 2.4 kilometers long, moving through the ice beneath the colony. "That's not possible," Park said from the doorway. Her voice was calm, but her calm had an edge to it now, a brittleness that suggested it might shatter if subjected to any additional stress. "Nothing biological is that large, nothing. The largest organism ever discovered on Earth was a fungal colony in Oregon that covered 9 square kilometers, but that was a colony. Individual organisms don't get that big. The physics don't allow it. Structural limitations, metabolic constraints, the square-cube law." "The square-cube law assumes Earth-normal biology," Okonkwo said quietly. She was looking at the hatchling in the stabilization unit, and her face had the expression of a woman who was watching her understanding of reality being dismantled one piece at a time, and was finding the process less frightening than she had expected. "This creature's cells are partially crystalline. Its metabolic processes operate in reverse. It generates cold instead of heat, which means it doesn't have the thermal regulation problem that limits the size of warm-blooded organisms. And its bones, based on the fossil records, are composed of a crystalline lattice structure that has a higher strength-to-weight ratio than any material we can manufacture. The square-cube law might not apply here. Nothing we know might apply here." The blue light from the stabilization unit pulsed again, and this time the pulse was stronger, not brighter exactly, but deeper, as if the light was reaching into parts of the room that light should not have been able to reach. The frost on the walls shifted, the crystals reorganizing themselves into patterns that had not been there a moment before, patterns that looked suspiciously like the patterns on the hatchling's scales, as if the cold in the room was responding to the hatchling's presence the way iron filings responded to a magnet, aligning themselves along invisible lines of force that radiated from the tiny creature in its frozen cocoon. The hatchling lifted its head. It was a small motion, just a few centimeters, the tiny neck extending and then relaxing like a person adjusting their pillow, but every person in the room saw it, and every person in the room went still because the hatchling's eyes had changed. They were still amber, still gold, still burning with that ancient intelligence, but there was something new in them now, a quality that Marcus could only describe as connection. Not the connection of a creature to its surroundings, but the connection of a node to a network, of a single voice to a chorus, of a drop of water to the ocean it had come from. The hatchling's eyes were not just looking at the room anymore. They were looking through it, past it, into something beyond the walls and the ice and the frozen sky, into a darkness that was not empty but was full of presence, full of awareness, full of something so vast and so old that the human mind could not perceive it directly but could feel its shadow, the way a person standing on a beach at night can feel the ocean without being able to see it. The hatchling opened its tiny jaw, and it made a sound. Not a whimper this time, not the desperate, broken cry that had reached Marcus on the glacier platform. This was something else entirely, a sound that existed at the intersection of music and mathematics, and something that had no name in any human language. It was a single note, clear and pure, that started at a frequency so low it was more vibration than sound and then rose, climbing through octaves with a fluidity that no human instrument could replicate, each octave adding harmonics and overtones that should not have been possible, that layered on top of each other like the colors of a sunset, each one distinct and yet each one blending seamlessly into the whole. It was the most beautiful sound Marcus had ever heard. It was also the most terrifying, because it was not a sound that a 2-kilogram creature should have been able to make, and it was not a sound that the walls of a prefab medical bay should have been able to contain, and yet it filled the room completely, not bouncing off the walls but passing through them as if they were not there, as if sound itself had become a different thing in the presence of this note, a thing that did not obey the old rules. The note lasted 5 seconds. Then it stopped, and the silence that replaced it was so total, so absolute, that Marcus could hear the individual cells of his body metabolizing, could hear the electrical signals firing in his brain, could hear the blood moving through his heart one beat at a time, each beat a separate event in a silence so deep that time itself seemed to have paused to listen. Then every sensor in the colony triggered at once. The lights flickered, not the brownout dim that happened during power fluctuations, but a violent, strobing flicker that turned the medical bay into a series of frozen snapshots, each flash capturing a different configuration of faces and frost and blue light. The floor vibrated. Not shook, not trembled, but vibrated with a frequency that Marcus felt in his teeth and his bones and the spaces between his vertebrae, a vibration that had the same quality as the hatchling's note, musical, mathematical, intentional, as if the ground itself was singing a harmony to a melody it had been waiting 10,000 years to hear. The frost on the walls cracked, not randomly, in patterns. The same patterns that had been forming since the hatchling entered the bay, the scale-like delta patterns that echoed the creature's biology, but now they were growing, spreading, connecting, forming a network of crystalline lines that covered every surface in the room and extended beyond it, beyond the walls, into the structure of the habitat itself. Marcus could see them through the open doorway, frost patterns racing down the corridor like veins of ice following the pathways of the station's infrastructure, tracing power conduits and water pipes and structural supports with a precision that mapped the colony's anatomy as completely as any blueprint. Okonkwo grabbed the edge of the examination table as the vibration intensified. Her diagnostic displays were going haywire, readings cascading across the screens in numbers that made no sense, temperature gauges swinging between extremes, biological monitors picking up signatures from every direction at once, as if the entire colony had suddenly become a single organism, and every sensor was reading a different part of it. "Sergeant," she said, and her voice was steady but her eyes were wide, "there's something moving beneath us." "I know, Diaz told me." "You don't understand, it's not just moving, it's rising." Marcus felt it then, not just the vibration but the thing causing it, the source of the resonance that was shaking the habitat apart. It was below them, directly below them, close enough that the distinction between below and here was becoming academic. He pressed his hand flat on the floor of the medical bay, and the cold that came up through the metal was not the cold of Kepler-7 surface. It was the cold of deep ice, ancient ice, ice that had been compressed under kilometers of pressure for millennia and had become something other than ice, a crystalline matrix that stored information the way ice on Earth stored bubbles of ancient atmosphere, except the information stored in this ice was not atmospheric. It was biological, it was memory. It was the recorded experience of something that had lived beneath this glacier for longer than human civilization had existed, and the memory was rising to the surface because the hatchling had called it, and the call had been answered. The hatchling made a second sound, softer than the first, a chirp, almost a small, crystalline trill that would have been cute if cute were a word that could be applied to anything happening in this room at this moment. The chirp resonated with the vibration in the floor, and the two frequencies merged and amplified, and the medical bay lights went out entirely. replaced by the blue luminescence that was now emanating from every surface in the room: the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the equipment, the stabilization unit, Marcus's own hands, which were glowing faintly with lines of blue light that traced the paths of his veins beneath his skin. The ground split. Not in the medical bay outside, somewhere beyond the habitat walls, in the snowfield between the colony and the glacier. Marcus heard it rather than saw it, a sound like the world breaking open, a deep, resonant crack that started as a bass rumble and rose through the frequencies until it became a shriek, a sound that was not mechanical and not geological but something in between, as if the planet itself was crying out in a voice that had been silent for 10,000 years and was now, finally, being used again. The vibration stopped. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. The before silence had been empty, the silence of absence. This silence was full of potential, full of presence, full of something so large that it could not be perceived directly but could only be felt as a pressure against the edges of perception, like standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark and knowing that the drop was there without being able to see it. Okonkwo checked her instruments. The displays had stabilized, the wild fluctuations resolving into readings that were strange but at least consistent. She studied them for a long moment, her brow furrowed, her lips moving slightly as she translated the data into something her mind could process. Then she looked at Marcus, and her face had the expression of a person who has just discovered that the universe is much larger and much stranger than they had ever imagined, and is not sure whether to be terrified or exhilarated. Sergeant, the thermal signatures beneath the glacier have reached the surface. They're no longer underground. The contacts are above ground now, all of them. All of them, Marcus repeated. All of them are one contact, one organism, and it is directly outside the habitat. She turned to one of the wall-mounted monitors that was still functioning and pulled up the external camera feed. The screen flickered, resolved, and showed the snowfield outside the habitat's main entrance. Something filled the frame. It was so large that the camera, which was calibrated to capture an area approximately 200 meters wide, could not show all of it. What was visible was a section of scaled surface, deep obsidian veined with blue light, the same blue light that pulsed in the hatchling scales, the same blue light that had spread across the medical bay walls, the same blue light that was now tracing patterns on Marcus's hands. The scales were each the size of a shuttlecraft door, arranged in overlapping rows that extended upward and outward beyond the camera's field of view. And between the scales, in the narrow gaps where the underlying musculature was visible, there was a glow, not the faint luminescence of the hatchling, but a deep, powerful radiance that pulsed with a rhythm that the medical bay's monitoring equipment picked up and displayed on Okonkwo's screens as a waveform so large and so regular that it looked less like a biological signal and more like a planetary heartbeat. The camera tilted upward, automated tracking, trying to find the top of whatever it was looking at. It tilted and tilted and tilted, and the top did not come, and the feed cut out as the camera's motor exceeded its operational limits, and the screen went dark, and the dark was full of blue light. "It's a dragon," Park said from the doorway. Her voice was barely a whisper. "An adult dragon. It's real. They're real. They were never extinct. They were just asleep." Marcus looked at the hatchling in the stabilization unit. The hatchling looked back at him. Its amber eyes were bright now, brighter than they had been since he found it, brighter than they had any right to be for a creature that had been dying 11 minutes ago. And in those eyes, Marcus saw something that he had been expecting since the moment the ground began to shake and the frost began to pattern and the blue light began to spread. He saw recognition. Not his recognition of the creature, but the creature's recognition of its own. The hatchling knew what was outside. It knew what had answered its call. It knew, with the certainty of a thing that had been connected to something vast since before it hatched, that its parent was here, that the enormous presence that had risen from beneath the glacier was the source of its existence, the architect of its biology, the ancient and incomprehensible being that had laid the egg from which this tiny, fragile, impossible creature had emerged into a world that was too warm for it and too cold for everything else. The hatchling opened its jaw and made a third sound, a single clear chime that cut through the silence of the medical bay, and through the walls of the habitat, and through the frozen air outside, and through the ice and the snow and the ancient, compressed darkness of Kepler-7 itself, a chime that was not heard but felt by every person in the colony and by every piece of equipment and by the planet beneath their feet, a chime that said in a language older than words, "Here I am safe, come." And outside the habitat, something so large that it blocked out the stars shifted its weight, and the ground trembled one final time, and the blue light that pulsed beneath its scales flared so brightly that every window in the colony simultaneously frosted over and then cleared, as if the cold itself had drawn a breath and then released it. And Marcus Vane sat on the floor of a medical bay on a frozen planet at the edge of human space, with a dragon hatchling in a stabilization unit beside him and an adult dragon the size of a mountain outside the door. And he understood, with a clarity that was not thought but something deeper, something that lived in the body rather than the mind, that everything had changed. Not in the way that people meant when they said everything changed. Not the gradual incremental change of a new policy or a new technology or a new understanding. This was the other kind of change, the tectonic kind, the kind that restructures the ground beneath your feet without asking permission, the kind that makes the world before the change and the world after the change into two different places that share the same name but nothing else. Minutes ago, humanity was alone on Kepler 7. Minutes ago, the dragons were extinct. Minutes ago, the cold was the enemy and the ice was the prison, and the stars were the only things that burned with any warmth in a universe that had forgotten what warmth meant. That world was gone now. It had ended not with a bang or a whimper, but with a chirp, a tiny crystalline chirp from a creature the size of his boot. And in its place was a new world, a world where the ice was not a tomb but a womb, where the cold was not death but life, where the dragons were not fossils but neighbors, and where a human soldier who had been carrying the weight of 7 dead people in his chest had found something unexpected in the blizzard. A reason to keep going that had nothing to do with duty or survival or the grim mathematics of frontier colonization, and everything to do with a pair of amber eyes that had looked at him and decided, against all evidence and all logic, that he was worth trusting. Marcus placed one finger against the frosted lid of the stabilization unit, directly above the hatchling's head. The blue light pulsed beneath his fingertip, and the hatchling's eyes closed, slowly, deliberately, with the trust of a creature that knew it was safe, and the light settled into a gentle, even glow that filled the medical bay with the soft radiance of a deep ocean scene from below. 6 minutes had passed since the hatchling had chirped. In 6 minutes, everything had changed.
The adult dragon lowered its head to ground level, and the world bent. Marcus watched through the external feeds as snow compressed inward around the creature in radial patterns, as if the ground itself was acknowledging something with a prior claim to it. The head alone dwarfed the colony's dropship, overlapping obsidian scales the size of vehicle doors, each one veined with blue luminescence that made the hatchling's faint glow look like a dying candle. The jaw opened slightly, and a breath poured out like a waterfall of frozen light, transforming the snowfield into geometric lattices of spiraling crystal towers that rose in architectures of impossible mathematics. The dragon was decorating. Marcus stood, "I'm going outside." Sergeant Diaz started. "If it were hostile, we'd already be dead." No one argued, they all knew it was true. Okonkwo stepped in front of the door. "Your core temperature." "Yuna, first name, 11 months and he'd never used it. The hatchling is stable, you don't need me." "I need you to not die." "Maybe, and I'm going anyways." She stepped aside. Behind him, the hatchling chirped once, soft, certain, go. He pushed through the doors. The cold hit like a wall of knives, but it moved around him, not through him, directed, textured, vast but purposeful. And then he looked up and his brain simply refused to process what it saw. The dragon filled the sky, wings like cliff faces. An eye amber gold, larger than his entire body, fixed on him with an examination that went through his skin, his bones, his memories, the 7 dead names he carried like stones. 4 seconds that lasted a lifetime. He did not look away. The examination ended, something softened, respect not for strength but for the choice, for reaching down when instinct said step back, for opening his jacket when protocol said stay sealed. The dragon exhaled. Not cold, the opposite of cold, the way relief is the opposite of anxiety. Frost dissolved from his skin, pain faded. His core temperature locked at exactly 37 degrees. The dragon was healing him with breath and intention. He reached into his jacket and pulled out what he'd forgotten was there, a crystal fragment from the hatchling's first breath on the glacier, carried against his chest like a lucky stone. He held it out, palms up, an offering, the oldest gesture in any language. The dragon breathed on the crystal. It completed, growing, unfolding like a blooming proof, becoming a perfect fist-sized gem that pulsed with the hatchling's rhythm. An exchange, not between governments, between a man and a mountain. Then the dragon spoke, not in words, in meaning, dropped into his mind like a stone into still water. "You held my child when the world was killing it. You were warm when everything was cold." And then the promise, "I will remember this when the stars change their positions and the mountains return to dust." Not protection, memory, permanent, indestructible, geological. What he had done would outlast empires. The wings unfolded, the dragon rose. On its neck, cradled between scales, the hatchling stirred, alive, bright home. It looked down at Marcus with something older than human love and chirped once, "Thank you, I will not forget, neither will the stars." The blizzard resumed. Marcus fell to his knees. When he looked up, the sky was empty. Only the crystal garden remained and the gem in his hand and the blue light pulsing beneath the skin of his right palm in the shape of a dragon's eye. He walked back inside, faces stared. Diaz asked if he was all right. Marcus held up his glowing hand. Get command, tell them the dragons aren't extinct, tell them this colony has a neighbor. He closed his fist. The cold and the grief inside him for the 7 dead, for everything this planet had taken, didn't cancel each other. They coexisted the way the hatchling's cold had coexisted with his warmth. Beneath the ice, something ancient pulsed once, not in anger. In recognition. The stars burned on, cold and bright and full of dragons.